this video, we're going to look at auto-saving to database. Saving to database requires optional module 2010. As of SoundCheck 17, all executables are 64-bit, so 64-bit database applications and drivers are required. Saving to database is supported with Microsoft SQL Server and Microsoft Access. You can connect with the DSN or UDL. I would recommend following along in the database chapter of the manual when setting up your database after watching this video. There's a lot of specific information that must be followed. There are 4 steps when setting up a database. First, you must determine the data store. Then you must ensure the data store contains the correct schema. Afterwards, you create the appropriate connect descriptor, either DSN or UDL, and then configure SoundCheck to use the connect descriptor. So let's look at the first point, determining the data store. Are we using SQL? Are we using Access? Will this be saved on a remote server or just to my local machine? Depending on those answers, you must install software or drivers both on the SoundCheck and database hosting computers. The drivers are available for free, distributed by Microsoft. For our first example, let's look at an SQL database saved on my local machine. Here's the server configuration manager, and here at the top, this Express server is what we're going to be using to save to. So now for the second question, I must ensure the data store contains the correct schema. In SoundCheck 17, we released Database version 2, which is a redesigned schema. But it does require SQL Server and isn't compatible with Access. But since I'm using SQL Server, that's what I'll set up in this example. To configure this, we have a file located in your SoundCheck installation under Database. Underneath is an overview of the schema. So how do we actually use this? I'll open up Server Management Studio. I'll log on to my Express server. And if we look at the databases, right now I only have the default databases. But I'm going to go to Open File and point to this createschema.sql file. It will load it up, and now all I have to do is click Execute. Now when I refresh this database, you'll see SoundCheck DB v2 show up under the databases. Our next step will be to create the appropriate connect descriptor. For the connector, we have 2 options, DSN or UDL. One caveat is if you're using SQL Server authentication with login ID and a password, you must use UDL. I'm not using that type of authentication, so either will work for me, but I'm going to start with DSN. To configure this, we'll go to Control Panel, Administrative Tools, and then Set up ODBC data sources, and again, this must be 64-bit. Now here's where we're going to configure our connector. I'm going to choose a System DSN and click Add. The type of driver I'm going to use is the SQL Server. I'll call this ODBC example. And for the server, if we go back to my Management Studio, again, we can look at what I have here. This is just going to be my local machine and then the Express server on it. So I'll just paste that right here into the server. I click Next to choose the authentication. I didn't change anything from the default, so I'll click Next again. On the next page, we can select the default database. We want to switch this from master to the SoundCheck database. There's a couple more options here, but nothing that I need to change, so I'll click Finished and test the data source. The test completed successfully, so we know that we've done it correctly. Now let's look at setting up a UDL. To make a UDL, the easiest way is to just create any file and then just change the extension from whatever the extension is to .udl. I'll create a text file, switch it from text to UDL, then open it up. On the Provider tab, we need to make sure we're using the provider for SQL Server. For server name, it's still my desktop and SQL Express. And here is if we were using a specific username and password, we could save this in the UDL. I'm not, so I'm just going to leave it as the default Windows security. When I click on the database, I'll again select SoundCheck DB v2 and test the connection. It's successful, so we can click OK, and we're all set with our UDL. Now the last step is to configure SoundCheck to point to either of those. For DSN, it's quite simple. All we'll do is enter the name of the DSN we created, so ODBC example. For UDL, we'll browse to the UDL file. I've opened up SoundCheck, and here's complete test using AmpConnect. I'm going to add a save to database step and open it. I'll select a couple of pieces of data here, and there's not a lot of other options we can select. Most everything is grayed out. Here is where we select database, and then we can use our UDL or DSN here. My UDL is on my desktop, called SC UDL, so I click Browse, and all I do is point to that file. I click OK, and run the sequence. So you can't really see much, but this means it worked. I'm going to open up the Management Studio, and then just quickly look at everything from the data run table. And you can see here the timestamp of the run I just completed. If I run the sequence again, rerun the same query, you can see we get another timestamp of the run that just happened. Now using the database v2 schema overview, I can make queries that pull out data however I want. Now instead of a UDL, let's use a DSN. You don't have to browse to anything here. I literally just write down the name of the DSN I created. I run the same query, and you can see there was one more data run. Just to show you if you did it wrong, if I type the name incorrectly, we're going to get an error as the autosave step runs. Next, let's take an example using a different data store. So instead of using SQL Server, I'm going to use Microsoft Access. Now we move on to step 2, make sure the schema matches. We can't use the v2 schema with Access, so we're going to use the v1 schema. We have an Access file located in SoundCheck database called the blank soundcheck database.mdb. The easiest way to get this set up and running is to copy this and use the copy as your database. I'll put it in the same folder and change the name of it to SoundCheck data. Our default database is read-only, so I'm just going to change that property as well. Next, we want to create the appropriate connect descriptor. Again, UDL or DSN. I have Access installed on my machine, but I still need some specific database drivers. So I'm going to the Microsoft Download Center. When I go to download this, we need to make sure we use the 64-bit version. Also, when installing Access, it's important to remember to install the 64-bit version here as well. Many Office installations are 32-bit by default. Just like SQL, we can use a DSN or UDL. The application setup will just be a little bit different. We'll set up a DSN first, and we'll start in the same place. The difference here is instead of using an SQL Server driver, you can see we have a bunch of new options from the Access drivers I installed. So I'll select my Access driver up here. I'm going to give my data source name SoundCheck DSN. And now I select my database. All we do here is navigate to the database we created on disk. So SoundCheck 17, database, and then I want my SoundCheck data.mdb. I point to that and my DSN is all set. Next, we'll set up the UDL. To start, we'll just create a text file, change the name and the extension. We'll call this one accessudl.udl. And then open it up. On the Provider tab, we'll switch this from SQL to the Office 16 Access Engine. For the connection data source, we're just going to put in the path to our database file. So I'll right-click, copy this path, paste it in here, and then just remove the quotations around it. I don't have a password, so once I test the connection, we're all set. Now the last step is again to configure SoundCheck to use the connect descriptor. We do this the same exact way. We either write in the DSN name or browse and point to the UDL file. I'll open this up and switch from our previous example, and I'll enter SoundCheck DSN. After I run the sequence, I can open up our access file and look through the tables and see the data that was populated from the last run. Now I switch from UDL to DSN, so I'll click the Browse button, point to my UDL location, and run the sequence again. And once more, after the step completes and the autosave step runs, I can open up my SoundCheck data access file and see all the data that's now populated from the most recent run. In the next video, we'll go over autosave to Excel.